now a certain Euthalius, at about the spring equinox, came to Terracina from Byzantium with the money which the emperor owed the soldiers. And fearing lest the enemy should come upon him on the road and both rob him of the money and kill him, he wrote to Belisarius requesting him to make the journey to Rome safe for him. Belisarius accordingly selected 100 men of note from among his own bodyguards and sent them with 2 spearmen to Terracina to assist him in bringing the money. And at the same time he kept trying to make the barbarians believe that he was about to fight with his whole army, his purpose being to prevent any of the enemy from leaving the vicinity, either to bring in provisions or for any other purpose. But when he found out that Euthalius and his men would arrive on the morrow, he arrayed his army and set it in order for battle, and the barbarians were in readiness. Now throughout the whole forenoon he merely held his soldiers near the gates, for he knew that Euthalius and those who accompanied him would arrive at night. Then, at midday, he commanded the army to take their lunch, and the Goths did the same thing, supposing that he was putting off the engagement to the following day. A little later, however, Belisarius sent Martinus and Valerian to the plain of Nero with the troops under their command, directing them to throw the enemy's camp into the greatest possible confusion. And from the small Pincian gate he sent out 600 horsemen against the camps of the barbarians, placing them under command of 3 of his own spearmen, Artacius, a Persian, and Bocchus, of the race of the Massagedae, and Cutulus, a Thracian. And many of the enemy came out to meet them. For a long time, however, the battle did not come to close quarters, but each side kept retreating when the other advanced and making pursuits in which they quickly turned back, until it looked as if they intended to spend the rest of the day at this sort of thing. But as they continued, they began at last to be filled with rage against each other. The battle then settled down to a fierce struggle in which many of the best men on both sides fell, and support came up for each of the 2 armies, both from the city and from the camps. And when these fresh troops were mingled with the fighters, the struggle became still greater. And the shouting which filled the city and the camps terrified the combatants. But finally the Romans by their valor forced back the enemy and routed them. In this action Cutulus was struck in the middle of the head by a javelin, and he kept on pursuing with the javelin still embedded in his head. And after the rout had taken place, he rode into the city at about sunset together with the other survivors, the javelin in his head waving about, a most extraordinary sight. During the same encounter Arzes, one of the guards of Belisarius, was hit by one of the Gothic archers between the nose and the right eye. And the point of the arrow penetrated as far as the neck behind, but it did not shoot through, and the rest of the shaft projected from his face and shook as the man rode. And when the Romans saw him and Cutulus they marveled greatly that both men continued to ride, paying no heed to their hurt. Such, then, was the course of events in that quarter. But in the plain of Nero the barbarians had the upper hand. For the men of Valerian and Martinus, fighting with a great multitude of the enemy, withstood them stoutly, to be sure, but suffered most terribly, and came into exceedingly great danger. And then Belisarius commanded Bocchus to take his troops, which had returned from the engagement unwearied, men as well as horses, and go to the plain of Nero. Now it was already late in the day. And when the men under Bocchus had come to the assistance of the Romans, suddenly the barbarians were turned to flight, and Bocchus, who had impetuously followed the pursuit to a great distance, came to be surrounded by 12 of the enemy, who carried spears. And they all struck him at once with their spears. But his corslet withstood the other blows, which therefore did not hurt him much, but one of the Goths succeeded in hitting him from behind, at a place where his body was uncovered, above the right armpit, very close to the shoulder, and smote the youth, though not with a mortal stroke, nor even one which brought him into danger of death. But another Goth struck him in front and pierced his left thigh, and cut the muscles there. It was not a straight blow, however, but only a slanting cut. But Valerian and Martinus saw what was happening, and coming to his rescue as quickly as possible, they routed the enemy, and both took hold of the bridle of Bocchus' horse, and so came into the city. Then night came on and Euthalius entered the city with the money. And when all had returned to the city, they attended to the wounded men. Now in the case of Arzes, though the physicians wished to draw the weapon from his face, they were for some time reluctant to do so, not so much on account of the eye, which they supposed could not possibly be saved, but for fear lest, by the cutting of membranes and tissues such as are very numerous in that region, they should cause the death of a man who was one of the best of the household of Belisarius. But afterwards one of the physicians, Theoctistus by name, pressed on the back of his neck and asked whether he felt much pain. And when the man said that he did feel pain, he said, "Then both you yourself will be saved and your sight will not be injured." And he made this declaration because he inferred that the barb of the weapon had penetrated to a point not far from the skin. Accordingly he cut off that part of the shaft which shoot outside and threw it away, and cutting open the skin at the back of the head, at the place where the man felt the most pain, he easily drew toward him the barb, which with its 3 sharp points now stuck out behind and brought with it the remaining portion of the weapon. Thus Arzas remained entirely free from serious harm, and not even a trace of his wound was left on his face. But as for Cutulus, when the javelin was drawn rather violently from his head, for it was very deeply embedded, he fell into a swoon. And since the membranes about the wound began to be inflamed, he fell a victim to phrenitis, 142, and died not long afterwards. Bocchus, however, immediately had a very severe hemorrhage in the thigh, and seemed like one who was presently to die. And the reason for the hemorrhage, according to what the physicians said, was that the blow had severed the muscle, not directly from the front, but by a slanting cut. In any event he died 3 days later. Because of these things, then, the Romans spent that whole night in deep grief, while from the Gothic camps were heard many sounds of wailing and loud lamentation. And the Romans indeed wondered, because they thought that no calamity of any consequence had befallen the enemy on the previous day, except, to be sure, that no small number of them had perished in the encounters. This had happened to them before in no less degree, perhaps even to a greater degree, but it had not greatly distressed them, so great were their numbers. However, it was learned on the following day that men of the greatest note from the camp in the plain of Nero were being bewailed by the Goths, men whom Bocchus had killed in his first charge. And other encounters also, though of no great importance, took place, which it has seemed to me unnecessary to chronicle. This, however, I will state, that altogether 67 encounters occurred during this siege, besides 2 final ones which will be described in the following narrative. And at that time the winter drew to its close, and thus ended the 2nd year of this war, the history of which Procopius has written.